In a quiet, upscale neighborhood lived a millionaire named Thomas. He was known for his success in the business world, but there was something even more remarkable about him: his deep love and appreciation for his childhood nanny, Evelyn. She had been more than just a caretaker to him. When his parents passed away, Evelyn had stepped in as his protector, mentor, and the closest thing to family that he had. Her kindness and wisdom shaped him into the man he became. The bond they shared was undeniable, built on years of trust, loyalty, and love. Thomas had married a woman named Claire, a beautiful, ambitious woman from a wealthy family. She was used to luxury, privilege, and being in control. At first, she was charmed by Evelyn's warm, motherly presence, but as time went on, a sense of discomfort began to grow in her. She didn't like how much Thomas relied on Evelyn for advice and support, especially when it came to matters of the family business. Claire wasn't used to sharing her husband's attention with anyone, and this small feeling of insecurity slowly turned into something more unsettling. While Thomas worked long hours at his business, Claire spent her days overseeing their lavish home, attending social gatherings, and organizing events with other high society families. But despite all the outward appearances of happiness, Claire couldn't help but feel threatened by Evelyn's constant presence in Thomas's life. To Claire, Evelyn represented a time before their marriage, a time when Thomas was entirely her own. No wife, no children, just Evelyn. Thomas never noticed the growing tension between the two women. He was too wrapped up in his work and his quiet appreciation for Evelyn, who was like a second mother to him. The nanny had always been there, whether he needed emotional support or just someone to talk to about the trials of life. But Claire's frustration was building, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. It was during one of the family's weekly gatherings at their estate that the breaking point finally arrived. Thomas had invited a few close friends over, and the evening was meant to be a celebration of their success. Everyone was enjoying dinner when Claire, unable to hold back her feelings any longer, lashed out. She began to criticize Evelyn in front of everyone, belittling her role in the family and accusing her of being too involved in their lives. The words were sharp and cutting, and the guests in the room were left in stunned silence. Evelyn, who had always been composed and dignified, was visibly shaken. She tried to keep her composure, but the humiliation was too much. Everyone in the room could feel the tension, and Thomas, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, was left in shock. His eyes were wide, his face pale, as he struggled to comprehend what was happening before him. His wife, the woman he had married, had just humiliated the person who had been his rock for so many years. It felt like his world had just shattered. For a long moment, no one said a word. The air was thick with discomfort. Evelyn, who had always been there for Thomas, stood there quietly, her face a mask of hurt and disbelief. Thomas felt like he had been slapped in the face. His wife, the woman he had vowed to cherish, had crossed a line that could not easily be erased. But what could he do? He had never imagined that his wife would act in such a way. In that moment, Thomas realized that the small crack between Evelyn and Claire had turned into an undeniable divide. And now, the question was, how would he handle the situation? Would he stand by his wife, or would he protect the woman who had been like a mother to him all these years? The decision ahead would be more difficult than anything he had ever faced before. The room fell silent after Claire's outburst. The guests at the dinner party exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react to the sudden tension. Evelyn stood there, her face a pale reflection of the hurt she felt. She had always been a quiet presence, never seeking attention or recognition. Yet now she found herself at the center of an uncomfortable storm. Her years of caring for Thomas had never prepared her for such an attack from someone she had once considered part of the family. She felt the weight of every word Claire had thrown at her, each one heavier than the last. Thomas was frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His mind raced as he looked from his wife to Evelyn, trying to make sense of the situation. His entire life had been built on the foundation of the love and respect he had for both of these women, and now he was being forced to choose between them. The shock on his face was unmistakable. He had never seen Claire act with such hostility before, and it was a side of her he never imagined existed. His wife, the woman he had married, had just humiliated Evelyn in front of everyone, without any regard for the years of loyalty and care she had given him. Evelyn's eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked them away, refusing to let anyone see her tears. She had always been strong, a pillar of support for Thomas, but now she felt vulnerable. It was as if the woman she had once welcomed into her life had become someone completely different. The bond they had shared seemed to unravel with each word Claire had spoken. Evelyn felt a mix of sadness and confusion. She had never asked for anything from Thomas or his family, just respect and appreciation. Yet now it seemed like even that was too much to expect. Claire, on the other hand, seemed completely unaware of the impact of her words. She had allowed her jealousy and insecurity to cloud her judgment, and now, standing in the aftermath of her actions, she was beginning to realize the magnitude of what she had done. She looked around the room, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Some guests had begun to shift uncomfortably in their seats, and a few had even started to quietly whisper among themselves. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and it was clear that the evening, once meant to be a celebration, had now become a battleground. Thomas finally found his voice, though it was shaky. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he did so. The room went even quieter, all eyes turning toward him. Evelyn looked at him, a sense of helplessness in her eyes. It was as if she was silently pleading for him to do something, anything, to make the situation right. But Thomas didn't know what to do. He had always been someone who valued peace and harmony, someone who believed in resolving conflicts with understanding. But what Claire had done to Evelyn was unforgivable. How could he let this go? "Claire," he said, his voice low but firm, "I can't believe you would speak to Evelyn like that. She's been here for me through everything, and you know that. I won't stand by and let you treat her this way." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. There was no going back now. Claire, still processing his response, opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if she was realizing, perhaps for the first time, the true depth of the bond between Thomas and Evelyn. Evelyn, still standing at the edge of the room, felt the room closing in on her. She had always stayed in the background, never asking for attention or recognition, but now the spotlight was on her, and she felt more isolated than ever. She had loved Thomas like a son, and all she wanted in return was his happiness. But could she continue to stay in this house, in this situation, knowing that the woman he married had no respect for her? The night had taken an unexpected turn, and Thomas knew that the decisions he made in the coming days would change everything. He couldn't let this stand. But the question was, what would be the next step? How could he repair the damage caused by Claire's words, and what would it mean for his relationship with both women? The days following the dinner party felt like a fog to Thomas. The confrontation with Claire had left him with a sense of confusion and guilt that lingered in the back of his mind. His home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and distant. Every corner reminded him of the growing rift between the two women he loved. Evelyn's hurt was evident, even if she tried to hide it behind her usual quiet demeanor. She had always been the one to offer comfort and wisdom, but now she seemed distant, retreating into herself more and more with each passing day. Thomas found himself torn. He wanted to fix things, to bring back the peace that had once existed in his family, but he didn't know where to start. He had always been the mediator, the one who calmed tensions and brought people together. But this time, things were different. The betrayal of the woman he had married cut deeper than he had expected, and the pain Evelyn was enduring weighed heavily on him. He had always known that Evelyn was more than just a caretaker. She was family. But now, in the wake of Claire's actions, it was impossible to ignore how much she truly meant to him. Evelyn had stopped coming to their home as frequently. She still worked in the background, handling the small details that kept the household running. but there was an unmistakable distance between her and the rest of the family. She seemed quieter, her once joyful presence reduced to a shadow. Thomas couldn't help but notice how much her absence affected the house. The laughter that had once filled the rooms was now replaced with silence. Even the meals that were once shared together felt strained, with Claire acting distant and cold, as though she regretted the confrontation but couldn't bring herself to apologize for it. Claire, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the consequences of her actions. The night of the argument had left her unsettled, and over the past few days, she found herself replaying the scene in her head. The way Thomas had looked at her, the disappointment in his eyes, it haunted her. She had never intended for things to go so far. She had acted out of frustration, a mix of jealousy and insecurity that clouded her judgment. But now, seeing the strain on Thomas's face and the absence of Evelyn, she realized just how much damage she had caused. She hadn't just hurt Evelyn. She had hurt the very foundation of their family. In her quiet moments, Claire found herself reflecting on the relationship she had with Evelyn. She had never truly understood how deep the bond was between Thomas and his nanny. She had always seen Evelyn as a relic of the past, someone who had no place in their present life. But now, seeing the way Thomas looked at Evelyn, the way he cared for her, made her realize that she had underestimated the importance of their connection. It was something that couldn't be easily erased, no matter how much she tried to control the situation. Thomas knew that something had to change. He couldn't continue living in this tension-filled house, pretending everything was normal when it wasn't. But he didn't know how to fix things. Should he confront Claire again, demand that she make things right with Evelyn? Or should he have a more difficult conversation with Evelyn herself, asking if she could ever forgive Claire for the humiliation she had endured? Every option seemed painful, and yet he knew that he couldn't sit back and let the situation fester. In the midst of this turmoil, the once harmonious home had become a place of quiet despair. The walls seemed to close in on Thomas, and the weight of his indecision threatened to suffocate him. He couldn't bear the thought of losing either woman, but he knew that, somehow, he would have to choose. The bond between Evelyn and Claire couldn't continue like this. One way or another, a resolution had to come. As Thomas sat in the living room late one evening, staring at the empty chairs where the three of them once sat together, he realized that he could no longer ignore the situation. Something had to change, and he was the only one who could make it happen. The next step would be the hardest yet, whether it was healing the rift between the women or making a difficult decision that would forever alter the course of his family's future. Days passed in silence, with the weight of the previous confrontation still hanging in the air. Thomas spent most of his time at work, trying to distract himself from the growing tension at home, but it was becoming harder to ignore. The house, once full of life and laughter, now felt empty and cold. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat down for a peaceful meal with both Claire and Evelyn. The distance between them was impossible to overlook. Evelyn, though always polite and respectful, had become noticeably withdrawn. She still came by occasionally to help with some household matters, but her presence felt different now. There was no warmth in her smile, no twinkle of humor in her eyes. It was as though the woman who had been a second mother to Thomas was slipping away, retreating into herself. He could see the hurt in her eyes whenever he tried to talk to her, and he hated the way he felt helpless to fix things. His connection with her was deeper than words could express, and seeing her so distant felt like losing a part of himself. Claire, on the other hand, had started to reflect more on her actions. She was surprised by how much the incident had affected her. She hadn't intended to hurt Evelyn, but her insecurities had gotten the better of her. She couldn't help but feel guilty for lashing out at someone who had done nothing but support and care for Thomas. As the days passed, she realized that her jealousy had clouded her judgment. She hadn't fully understood the depth of the bond between Thomas and Evelyn, and now she saw how her actions had disrupted the fragile peace of their home. Claire found herself in an emotional tug-of-war. She wanted to apologize to Evelyn, to make things right, but her pride stood in the way. It wasn't easy for her to admit that she had made a mistake, especially when she felt so justified in her feelings at the time. She knew that if she wanted to repair things, she had to swallow her pride. But every time she thought about apologizing, she hesitated. The thought of facing Evelyn after what she had done made her feel ashamed. One evening, Thomas finally reached his breaking point. He couldn't stand the tension anymore. He needed to act before things got any worse. After dinner, he sat down with Claire in their living room, hoping they could have a conversation that would finally bring some resolution. The air felt thick with unspoken words, but Thomas knew that it was now or never. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and looked Claire in the eyes. "Claire, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Claire glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She had been expecting this conversation for days, but hadn't known when it would come. She nodded quietly, waiting for him to continue. "I can't keep pretending that everything's fine," Thomas continued. "What happened that night? It wasn't just about the argument. It's about respect. I can't stand by and watch someone I care about, someone who's been a part of my life for so long, be treated like that. Evelyn didn't deserve that, and I won't stand by and let it happen again." Claire's face flushed with guilt, but she remained silent, unsure of what to say. She knew Thomas was right, but the thought of admitting her mistake felt like too much. "I need you to apologize to Evelyn," Thomas added softly, but with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "She's been nothing but kind to you. And this is about more than just the argument. It's about understanding and respect. If we're going to move forward, we have to fix this. You have to fix this." Claire's heart sank. She knew he was right. She had been so wrapped up in her own feelings that she hadn't considered how her actions would affect everyone else. She had hurt Evelyn in a way that couldn't be taken back with a simple apology. And now Thomas was asking her to make things right, to face the woman she had humiliated and restore the bond they once shared. As the conversation continued, Claire felt the weight of her actions bear down on her. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she realized that this was the only way forward. She would have to swallow her pride, apologize, and hope that Evelyn would find it in her heart to forgive her. But would Evelyn even want to forgive her? Would she be able to look past the hurt and see that Claire was genuinely remorseful? The questions lingered in Claire's mind as she prepared for the difficult task ahead. The next few days were filled with quiet reflection for Claire. She knew she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. The weight of her actions was pressing down on her, and it was impossible to move forward without addressing what had happened. Every time she saw Thomas, she could feel the distance between them growing. The look in his eyes was one of disappointment, something she hadn't expected. He had always been her partner, her confidant, and now, for the first time, she felt that their connection was slipping through her fingers. It was late one afternoon when Claire finally decided to take action. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. After a long day spent in silence, she knew she had to face Evelyn, to apologize for what she had done and try to repair the damage she had caused. She wasn't sure how Evelyn would react, but Claire knew she couldn't live with the guilt any longer. With a deep breath, she called Thomas into the living room. He looked at her curiously, sensing that something was about to change. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to expect. "I've made a decision," Claire said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I'm going to apologize to Evelyn." Thomas raised his eyebrows, surprised but pleased by her words. He had been hoping for this, but he wasn't sure when Claire would be ready to take that step. "Good," he said quietly. "She deserves that." Claire nodded, her hands trembling slightly. I know I was wrong, and I can't take back what I said. But I can try to make things right. I've been thinking about it, and I realize how much she means to you, and how much she's done for this family. I shouldn't have treated her that way." Thomas watched her, the lines of worry on his face slowly easing. It was clear that Claire had fought this through, and that made him feel a bit of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but Claire was finally acknowledging the hurt she had caused. The next morning, Claire found herself standing at the door to Evelyn's small apartment. She had never been inside before, but today, it felt like the most important step in mending what had been broken. As she knocked, her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would Evelyn even want to hear her apology? Would she be able to forgive her? When the door opened, Evelyn stood there, her face kind but guarded. She hadn't expected Claire to come by, and she didn't know what to make of the serious look on her face. Claire felt the weight of the moment as she stood there, unsure of how to start. I wanted to talk to you," Claire began, her voice soft. "I know I hurt you, and I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I owe you an apology. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. You've always been there for Thomas, and you didn't deserve any of the things I said. I let my jealousy and insecurities cloud my judgment. And for that, I'm truly sorry." Evelyn didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there, looking at Claire with a mix of surprise and caution. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Claire to come to her and admit what she had done. It was clear that Claire was being sincere, but Evelyn's heart still ached from the words Claire had spoken to her at the dinner party. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt in an instant, no matter how heartfelt the apology. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Claire continued, her voice trembling. "But I want you to know that I understand now. You're important to Thomas, and I've been selfish. I just want to make things right." There was a long pause. Evelyn's eyes softened as she listened to Claire's words. She had never expected Claire to come to her like this, but she could see that she was genuine. Evelyn knew that forgiveness wasn't a quick process, but she appreciated the effort Claire was making. She had always believed that people could change, and maybe, just maybe, this was a step in the right direction. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I appreciate your apology, Claire. It means more than you know." She paused, her eyes meeting Claire's. "But I need time. I can't just forget what happened, and I don't know if things will ever be the same. But I'll try. For Thomas." Claire nodded, understanding the need for patience. She had hoped for forgiveness, but she knew that rebuilding trust would take time. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was willing to do whatever it took. As Claire left Evelyn's apartment that day, she felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't over, but it was a start. She had taken the first step toward repairing the damage she had caused, and now it was up to time and effort to heal the rift between them. But for the first time in a while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be fixed after all. After Claire's apology to Evelyn, the air in the house seemed to shift slightly. It wasn't an instant change. Things couldn't be fixed that quickly. But there was a sense of quiet relief in the air. Thomas noticed the subtle difference, the way Claire seemed to be more present, more aware of her actions, and how Evelyn, though still reserved, didn't seem as distant. It was as though the first cracks in the wall of tension were beginning to form, but it would take time for the rest to crumble. For a few days, life went on as usual. Thomas continued with his work, and Claire tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. She made more of an effort to speak to Evelyn when she was around, offering her help with small tasks around the house, though the interactions remained polite and careful. Evelyn, on the other hand, still kept her distance. She was polite, but there was an unmistakable coolness in her manner that made it clear that she was still processing everything. Her trust hadn't been restored yet, and Claire knew that she couldn't rush it. She would have to wait and prove through her actions that she was truly sincere. Thomas spent a lot of time thinking about the situation. He had always tried to keep the peace, but now it felt like the foundation of his family was shifting. He had always considered Claire and Evelyn both to be incredibly important parts of his life, yet he was beginning to realize that he couldn't simply ignore the damage caused. He knew that Claire's apology was a start, but that alone wouldn't make everything right. He needed to be the bridge between them, but he wasn't sure how to do that without making it worse. As the days passed, Claire and Evelyn began to interact more. though their conversations were mostly small and centered around household matters. It was clear that both women were walking on eggshells, trying not to cause more tension. Still, the more time they spent together, the more Claire could sense that Evelyn was opening up, just a little. There were moments when their eyes would meet, and Claire could see the flicker of something, maybe understanding, maybe forgiveness, though it was still buried under layers of hurt. One evening, as they were sitting together at dinner, a quiet moment passed between them. Evelyn had been working late, preparing a special dinner for Thomas, and Claire had offered to help. The two of them spent the evening in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, cooking, and sharing small talk. It wasn't much, but for Claire, it felt like progress. She could see Evelyn slowly allowing herself to interact more, even if just a little. And for the first time in weeks, Claire felt like they were beginning to bridge the gap between them. Thomas noticed the shift as well. He couldn't help but observe the way his wife and his childhood nanny moved through the house, working side by side with less tension between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. For the first time since the argument, he saw glimpses of the harmony he once had in his home. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of discomfort, but there was a sense of effort, a genuine attempt to heal. Claire wasn't naive enough to believe that things could be fixed overnight. She knew that trust couldn't be rushed, and that Evelyn had every right to take her time. But as the days went by, Claire could sense that the bond between them wasn't entirely broken. It was fragile, but it was there, and it was something worth rebuilding. She just needed to be patient, to continue showing Evelyn that she was sincere in her desire to make things right. One afternoon, as Claire was arranging flowers in the living room, Evelyn came in quietly, carrying a small package. It wasn't an unusual gesture, but there was something different in the way she approached Claire. She smiled, just a little, but enough to make Claire's heart lift. "I thought you might like this," Evelyn said, holding out the small package. "I made it for you." Claire looked at the package, unsure at first. But when she opened it, she found a small handmade scarf, carefully crafted with soft threads. It wasn't expensive, but it was thoughtful. And it was the first time Evelyn had offered something like this since the incident. The gesture wasn't lost on Claire. She could feel the effort behind it, the quiet step toward reconciliation. "Thank you, Evelyn," Claire said, her voice soft. "It's beautiful." Evelyn simply nodded, her expression warm but cautious. There was still distance, but it wasn't as wide as before. Claire knew that the journey to rebuilding their relationship wasn't over, but in that small moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. It was a start, a small one, but a start nonetheless. The days that followed continued with small but significant changes. Thomas could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house, a sense of something healing, though the process was slow. There were still moments of awkwardness, especially when the three of them were in the same room together, but the tension that had once been suffocating was no longer as palpable. It was like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm, breaking through the clouds but still distant. The clouds hadn't completely parted, but the storm was over, and that alone made everything feel more hopeful. Claire had spent the past few days doing everything she could to show Evelyn that her apology was genuine. She made more of an effort to help with small tasks, from setting the table to running errands for her. It wasn't much, but Evelyn seemed to appreciate the effort. While the conversations remained polite and light, there was a gradual, unspoken understanding growing between the two women. It was clear that neither of them expected everything to be fixed overnight, but the simple fact that they were both willing to try was progress. Evelyn, though still cautious, had started to open up a little more. She would smile faintly when Claire spoke, and though her words were often brief, there was a warmth in her tone that hadn't been there before. For Claire, it was a sign that Evelyn was beginning to forgive, not completely, but she was willing to move forward. The first step was the hardest, but it seemed like they were starting to find a new rhythm, one built on small gestures and quiet acts of kindness. One evening after dinner, Thomas sat down in the living room, his thoughts racing. He had been observing everything closely, trying to understand the subtle changes. It was obvious that both Claire and Evelyn were trying, but he also knew that it wasn't enough. They were still on fragile ground, and as much as he wanted everything to be okay, he knew that it would take more than just time and effort. There had to be something more. He had to make sure that the healing process wasn't only happening between the two women, but within himself as well. He had always tried to stay neutral, to be the peacekeeper, but now he realized that his neutrality had made him a passive observer rather than an active participant in mending the situation. It was time for him to step in, to make a choice about what he wanted for the future, both for himself and for his family. He loved Evelyn in a way that only a son could love a mother, but he had also built a life with Claire. The tension that had existed between them could not be ignored any longer. It wasn't just about what they had done or said. It was about what they all needed moving forward. The next evening, Thomas called both women together. Evelyn and Claire entered the living room, looking a little surprised but willing to listen. It had been a while since they had all sat together like this, and Thomas could see that both women were nervous. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he knew it was necessary. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice calm but serious. "I know things haven't been easy, and we've all made mistakes, but I can't keep pretending that everything will just fall into place on its own. I care about both of you, and I can't ignore how important you both are to me. But we need to make a choice, whether we move forward together as a family or we continue letting this distance grow." There was a heavy silence in the room. Evelyn looked down at her hands, and Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to put his thoughts into words. "We've been living in this strange limbo," he continued, "and I'm not asking for miracles. I know things can't go back to the way they were before, but I want us to find a way to move forward. We need to rebuild, not just for my sake, but for all of us. But I can't do it alone. We all have to be committed to making it work." Claire looked at him, her expression a mix of guilt and determination. "I'm willing to try," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I know I hurt both of you, and I'm truly sorry for that. I want to be a better person, for you, for Thomas, and for Evelyn." Evelyn's eyes met Claire's, and for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of something in them, something like understanding. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. Evelyn nodded slowly, her voice quiet but steady. "I can try too. I don't know if things will ever be the same, but I can try." Thomas felt a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was the first step toward one. They were all willing to make an effort, to face the discomfort, the awkwardness, and the pain. They were ready to try again, not because it was easy, but because they knew it was worth it. The journey ahead wouldn't be simple, and it would take time. But for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt like there was hope for the future. The cracks in their relationship were still there, but now they were all ready to work together to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't going to be perfect, but they were willing to try. And sometimes, that was enough to make all the difference. Weeks passed, and the efforts to heal the fractures in their family continued, though the road ahead was still uncertain. Thomas, Claire, and Evelyn all knew that the tension that had once dominated their home wasn't something that could disappear overnight. There were still awkward silences, unspoken words, and old wounds that hadn't fully healed, but there was a quiet understanding among them. They were trying, and that meant something. The mornings began to feel a little more normal. Evelyn resumed her usual tasks in the house, but this time, there was less distance between her and Claire. They still weren't as close as they had once been, but the walls of tension were slowly crumbling. Claire would greet Evelyn with a smile, and Evelyn would nod, offering a small smile in return. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Every time they managed a small interaction without the weight of past hurt hanging over them, it felt like a tiny victory. Thomas, for his part, did his best to encourage these small steps. He didn't want to push too hard, but he also knew that silence wasn't the answer. He found moments to speak with both women individually, offering his support and showing that he was there for them, no matter how awkward things still felt. He kept reminding them that this wasn't about pretending the past didn't happen, but about finding a way forward, even if it took time. Slowly, things were changing. Then, one evening, there was a shift. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was significant nonetheless. Evelyn had prepared dinner, and this time, Claire had offered to help. The two of them were in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and organizing plates, when Claire glanced over at Evelyn, her heart pounding slightly. She had been thinking about this moment for days, and now she wasn't sure what to say. Evelyn looked up at her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no bitterness, no anger in Evelyn's gaze, just the quiet understanding that had been missing for so long. "I know it's been a long time," Claire said softly, her voice a little uncertain, "but I just want you to know that I'm trying. I'm really trying." Evelyn paused, putting down the knife she had been using. There was a moment of silence, and then she nodded. "I know. I can see that." It wasn't a grand gesture, but for Claire, it felt like the first real sign that things were shifting between them. Evelyn didn't offer forgiveness in that moment, but she didn't need to. What mattered was that she was acknowledging Claire's effort, and that was enough for now. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual, but in a peaceful way. The three of them sat around the table, eating and talking about everyday things. There were no long emotional discussions or attempts to resolve everything at once. Instead, they shared small moments of connection, whether it was Thomas asking Evelyn how her day had gone, or Claire laughing at a story Evelyn told about something that had happened years ago. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was a change, and that felt important. As the evening came to an end, Thomas looked at both women. He could see the effort in their eyes, the willingness to move forward, even if they weren't quite sure what the future held. There was still work to be done, still things to address and heal, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the perfect resolution he had hoped for, but it was something real, something that could grow over time. As the night came to a close and the house settled into a quiet calm, Thomas realized that this was the beginning of something new. They had all learned in their own way that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to move forward, even when the past couldn't be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, they continued on this path, taking it one day at a time. There were still bumps along the way, moments when old frustrations bubbled to the surface, or when words went unsaid. But now, there was a shared commitment to working through those challenges together. Thomas knew that their relationship would never be perfect, but that wasn't the point. The point was that they were trying, and in the end, that was all anyone could do. And with that understanding, the house began to feel like home again, not because everything had been fixed, but because they had learned how to live with the imperfections and to grow from them. It wasn't a perfect family, but it was a family, one that was slowly but surely finding its way back to each other.